2022 SEC Football Media Days are underway. Remember our coverage brought to you locally by Jerry Lane, Rejuvenate, and by DraftKings. New LSU head coach Brian Kelly has already addressed the masses, so let's talk about the Tigers here in this segment. Last year, LSU 6-7 straight up. Against the spread, very similar. The Tigers were 5-7-1. Right now, ahead of the 2022 season, LSU has 70-1 odds to win the SEC. Their win total set at over under 7, over at plus 115 odds, under at minus 135. And we know that Brian Kelly hasn't spoken at any media day in the last 12 years, not since he was last at Cincinnati. But today he did have a lot to say, some interesting comments that we'll recap right here. But I just want to start the segment, Musso, talking about Brian Kelly discussing the last 6 or 7 months and how interesting they've been for him, all the work he's had to do, you know, talking about LSU and coming here being the right move, like he's been doing the last 6 or 7 months. But I am very excited that from this point on, we'll discuss more of Brian Kelly's coaching, his actual plans for the team, strategies, and not things like his dance moves and his quote-unquote Southern accent. So very excited about that. Already got started today.
Although the Southern accent did get brought up today.
Yes, it did.
It did. And look, it was fine. Brian, BK took it in stride, even cracked a joke about it. I mean, that's kind of how he's handled all that, and I think it's been great. I'll be honest, though. Anything that Brian Kelly said today didn't really sound much different than what we've heard him say during spring or things like that. I mean, on a more national scale, obviously it was the first time many were hearing it around the conference, but he said kind of the same thing really to me. I mean, he wasn't going to go. I mean, he talked about the quarterbacks, but it wasn't anything like to give you any kind of inclination of who's going. It's just they say, these Miles does this well, Jaden does this well, Nuss does this well, Walker does this well. It was just that kind of stuff. And I did find this stuff about trust interesting, though. Trust is a two-way street, and that's how they really. He mentioned John Emery specifically and Miles Brennan and Kayshon Boutte as guys who have earned trust, which the Boutte thing's interesting because of conversations he had, kind of in the spring about Boutte reacclimating himself to the team. But nothing really jumped out, I guess, as a landmark because I feel like we here had heard it ever since Brian Kelly took the job from his opening press conference through the multiple times we heard him during spring. It was kind of just everything on that same plane.
I was a little confused to hear the outside perception about NIL and LSU. People asked him if he thought he was behind, and he made it very clear that he did not think that they were behind, and there's no really proof that shows that. They're doing really good in recruiting right now.
That was the one surprising. And that was the first question. Actually, I think Ron Higgins asked that question. First question out the chute about them falling behind in NIL. And that was the interesting thing because Ron specifically asked about a collective and do you not have enough funds in that collective? And Brian Kelly talked fairly openly about that more than any other coach really has. Normally when you've heard a coach be asked about a collective, they've said, I'm not involved in that or whatnot. And Brian Kelly said, I'm not aware that we don't have a lack of funds. We're not being outbid for players. We're not bidding for players. That's not what NIL is for. And we feel comfortable with where we are. So that would have been probably the most interesting thing just because of how openly he kind of talked about it. Didn't run away from a collective. I mean, Jimbo would have probably peed his pants up there if he got asked that question.
No, he did not seem worried at all, and I don't think LSU fans should be worried either, at least not in that regard. He talked a little bit about the quarterbacks, and like you said, kind of an extension of what he's been saying all offseason, and to me, it's clear that he has a system that he wants to implement, and he's going to fit players to that system, mainly the quarterbacks, in year one, not the other way around, but I think that's a good thing. I think LSU needs a lot of structure, and when talking about the offense specifically, he talked about how the spring period, the spring practice for LSU was more about installation, not about specific player abilities, which is common for a new coach. But just one thought that I have, kind of speculating on what Brian Kelly wants the offense to look like this year, I think getting the run game back going is going to be a huge priority for Brian Kelly in year one. And we talk about the offensive line a lot, some reshuffling there. Campbell's going to start as a true freshman, but I like that the offensive line has some potential because it's had continuity the last couple of years, and that hasn't really been a good thing. just because you have guys coming back doesn't mean it's going to be a new unit. Now you have a really talented freshman. You have some transfers that could play right away. And if they're able to get that run game going, that can open up the rest of LSU's offense. And maybe you could see guys like John Emery have a lot of success.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that is absolutely a focus for Brian Kelly. He said it all throughout the spring. He said it again today. If you want to win the SEC West and the SEC, you have to run the football. And his teams in the past, whether it be at Notre Dame, at Cincinnati, wherever, they've been very successful at running the football. What's interesting with that, you could talk about John Emery and Noah Cain and Armani Goodwin or Trey Bradford or the litany of running backs that LSU has that could potentially burst out onto the scene this year. We're all expecting a breakout season for John Emery, right? I mean, you've seen it in such flashes from the guy in his time, whether it was as a true freshman with the long touchdown run against Arkansas in 2019, the big game against Vanderbilt in 2020, the long touchdown run against Alabama in 2020 when that game was still semi-competitive. You were expecting him to break out last year. We know what happened. So, of course, you want to look at that. But for me, it's going to start with the offensive line. And you mentioned Will Campbell, and it was always interesting to hear Brian Kelly talk about in the spring Will Campbell, when they inserted him at left tackle, that's really when it started to come together up front for them. That's when they really started to see strides, which is a hell of a compliment to an 18-year-old who you plug in at a position that traditionally you don't see an 18-year-old play at this level. I mean, that is probably the ultimate compliment you could give him. But you look at a guy like Miles Frazier as well coming in as a transfer who could possibly play early. Charles Turner, they've been kind of focusing on him at center, at least later in spring. That is where it's going to be so key for LSU. And I feel like you should have optimism there along the offensive line. Granted, look, it's a huge question mark, but think about last year. They weren't good, but by the end of the year, they were serviceable under Brad Davis. And now he's got an entire offseason, new crop, transfers coming in. They've seemed like they've gotten guys in much better shape than they were in along the offensive line the last couple of years. You have depth there. I mean, you have two five-man rotations you can run in and out. It's just how far can you bring them along, and that's going to be ultimately the key for them running the football. Then you can look for that breakout season from John Emery or Noah Cain or whoever.
They improved a lot, the offensive line, and I'll give a lot of credit to TDP towards the end too. I think he really got them going with his running abilities and just kind of his leadership. But Brian Kelly has been really, really complimentary to Brad Davis since he took the job, and that's the only assistant that he kept from the last regime. So I think that speaks volumes as well. The offensive line might take lumps just because of inexperience in the beginning, but in the first 2 or 3 games, I think they're going to perform a lot better than they did last season. And hopefully that lays the foundation for a better season. I do want to talk a little bit about the players that represented LSU today. Jack Betch, Mike Jones, BJ Ojolari, I believe all already wrapped up their interviews, and all those guys obviously should be critical to how LSU performs this season. And Jack Betch, to me, is kind of the story, the fact that he's even at media days, because LSU is so loaded at wide receiver, both with young talent and with veteran talent. And remember, Jack Betch almost didn't go to LSU. He was committed to Vanderbilt for most of his high school career. His junior year, the past regime, the old LSU coaching staff saw his tape when they were watching one of Walker Howard's games, and they were like, this guy doesn't have an offer yet. Maybe we should get him on campus. 2 years later, not only is he starting for LSU, but he's representing them at media day. And I think that speaks volumes for the plans that they have for Jack Betch in a very loaded wide receiver room.
You mentioned the loaded wide receiver room. Let me ask you this, because I'm interested on your take on this. Do you think it matters who the quarterback is, or is that room just going to produce regardless? Because you do have Kayshon Boutte, Jack Betch, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, Chris Hilton. You even have transfer Kyron Lacey, Jeray Jenkins. You are stacked. Do you think it matters who the quarterback is, or are they going to produce regardless in the passing game?
I don't think it matters as much in year one because of what I said. I think they really want to establish a running game and then kind of go from there. It, again, fit the players to the system, not the other way around. So I think in year one, it's not going to matter as much. Year two, when they have a little bit of a better understanding of what some of these guys can do, then maybe you see them mess around, alter some stuff. But in year one, it's very clear that they have a system in place, and whoever can master that system the best out of Miles Brennan and Nussmeier and Jaden Daniels is going to get a really good chance to start this season. And that's going to be kind of the priority for Den Brock and for Kelly in year one. That's what I think.
I guess a better way I could have worded that is what's more important, the quarterback to the wide receiver, or the wide receiver to the quarterback, right? Does that make sense? Because it's like Kayshon Boutte last year when he was out there, LSU's passing offense was awesome. I mean, the guy was it didn't matter. You knew they were throwing him the ball, and you still couldn't cover him. I mean, think about the first drive of the Auburn game last year, right? He had 3 catches for almost 100 yards on that drive, and you knew the ball was going to him, especially at that point in the year, but you still couldn't stop it. So is that a benefit to whoever plays quarterback, whether it's Jaden Daniels, Miles Brennan, Garrett Nussmeier? We all know Walker's going to take the red shirt, but are the wide receivers more important to them in that sense, where maybe that's how it just, as long as you have that crop, the quarterback's going to be able to have success?
I think so, because you have a lot of receivers that can do a lot of different things. You have guys that can utilize the middle of the field, like Besh. We saw a lot of that last year. You have guys that can take the top off of defense, like Neighbors, who has some burners, and you have some guys that can kind of do it all. Butte and the upperclassman, whose name escaping me. Game-winning touchdown against A&M. Jerez Jenkins. So, yeah, you're really deep there, and I think that's going to be kind of part of the system. It doesn't work without a good running game, but the quarterback will definitely play off of the wide receivers.
How are we feeling about the defense before we really dive into win total here? I know we're kind of going heavy, but defensively it's LSU day, SEC Media Days. Defensive line, they're going to be really good, right? I mean, look, Brian Kelly was extremely complimentary of Mason Smith all day today, whether it was in the podium on the main room, whether it was on his hit on the SEC Network. Said that Mason Smith could be the best he's seen. And look, it backs what you saw last year, backs it up, inside or outside. So you love where you are there. You have Ojulari, who's with them in Atlanta. You have Ali Gay, Jaquelin Roy, Jacoby and Guillory, Quincy Wiggins as a young freshman. I mean, Savion Jones even. They're stacked there. Linebacker and secondary are kind of the question marks there. But I think you have a chance to be really good in the secondary just because of depth. Cornerback concerns me more than safety. Linebacker, I think you lack a little bit of depth, and you definitely lack experience.
Linebackers,
outside of Micah Baskerville.
I agree. Linebacker's the big question to me. I think you did as good in the transfer portal as you could to try to supplement the secondary with Seven Woods and with Bernard Converse. Linebacker, I love the starters. You bringing back Mike Jones and Penn and Micah Baskerville, who's been here forever, but what's behind them? Not very much depth there. You're talking about maybe Harold Perkins having to take some snaps as a freshman, or DeMario Tolan as well. But I love the front four. I think the defensive line is one of the best in the conference, if not the country. I think the secondary will be serviceable, but the big question for me, after losing Blake Baker, who we talked about going to Missouri as their new DC, will be the linebackers, and do they have enough depth there?
Yeah, I mean, because that's a question. I mean, look, you bring in West Weeks. Obviously, Greg Penn's been getting a lot of run. Micah Baskerville is your leading returning tackler, and you expect him to be good. You heard Brian Kelly in the spring talk a lot about Mike Jones improving in the middle and specifically improving his communication. Like, you feel good with that front line, but it's kind of what's behind them. You don't want injuries at the linebacker spot for LSU. I mean, the walk-on who was going to start last year before he got hurt. Yes, Jerez Small. He's back again. How does that fit in there? Linebacker is a concern, but I think you have a lot of talent there where if it comes together, and they stay healthy, you'll like how that shakes out, especially with guys like Baskerville, Penn, Jones, and that kind of front line. You still have Philip Webb too, by the way. Philip Webb is still on this team, and I think we haven't seen him play much.
And that's also Matt House's position group. He specializes with linebackers, was just working with NFL guys, so maybe that'll be an advantage. But LSU set up pretty okay on defense. Some questions about the linebacker depth.